again. We got rusty over the summer.
Yeah.
Welcome to everybody, and thank you for coming out tonight. I did just want to update people. We are in the midst of considering the possibility of doing hybrid meetings where we would have some in-person meetings and still do some Zoom meetings, maybe at the same time. We're trying to figure it all out, but this way we know that we get a better turnout with the Zoom meetings, and we're just going to continue it till we really have it all figured out on how to do it differently. And meanwhile, hopefully COVID just keeps going down and down, and it won't be a problem. So just to remind you, if you have a question for Mike, Ken will introduce, and he'll talk to us in a minute, tell us more about himself. But if you have a question during the presentation, if you'd put it in the chat below, that would be super. And then we will leave plenty of time to answer questions. Or if it's something in the middle of the talk that has to be answered immediately, I'll take a look at it in the chat and tell Mike so he can stop if he needs to. He's very comfortable doing whatever we want, so no problem. If anyone's seen some good birds, please put that in the chat too. We need a bird fix. I've been loving hearing about Lewis's woodpeckers this year, this season. It's amazing. Big flocks of them at Lake Solano and up near Bobcat. I think it's going to be quite the year for Lewis's. So, okay. Ken, are you ready to introduce our speaker and take it from there?
Yes, I'm ready to give a brief introduction and turn it over to Mike. But all right, okay, here we go. Welcome. Thank you all for joining us tonight. Tonight we have Mike Lyons. He's the Director of Public Policy for Audubon, California. And as most of you know, it is the state office of the National Audubon Society. Mike has an interesting background, so we thought it would have more impact if Mike were to tell you a little bit about his background and how he got to where he is today and what he's going to talk about tonight. So, Mike, it's all you.
I've done this before. I haven't been doing this for 2.5 years. So great. Well, my name is Mike Lyons. I'm the Director of Public Policy for Audubon, California, which is the state office of the National Audubon Society. Probably most of you know that. But I wanted to give a little bit of background about myself so you may understand a little bit where I'm coming at with some of the issues I want to talk about tonight and some of my perspective, maybe biases. So I started my career as a field biologist or ornithologist with what was then the Point Reyes Bird Observatory back in the 1990s and became now Point Blue Conservation Science. And at the time, for about 5-6 years, I worked in oak woodlands, riparian habitats, wetlands, coastal sage scrub, and a lot of other habitats all up and down the state, focused on birds, what their needs were for habitat and restoration and things like that, before going to law school and focusing on environmental law and policy. I litigated on behalf of nonprofit groups for a little while to enforce environmental laws. And then in 2008, I joined Golden Gate Audubon Society as its conservation director, and then its executive director. And it was really focused on a wide suite of conservation issues in the San Francisco Bay Area. Since I joined Audubon, California in 2014, my job as the state policy director is to really kind of put my nose in every issue, a major issue that impacts birds across the state. So I work on major sort of regional issues like the Salton Sea or Central Valley wetlands or the Klamath or coastal wetlands, for example, and offshore coastal habitats. I also work on state legislation, which I'll touch a bit on tonight, and federal legislation and budget as it lands here in California. So I just wanted to share a little bit about like how I work and how I work at Audubon, California. in order to give you a little bit of the perspective that I'm coming at. So tonight, what I thought I would do is really what we're kind of build this talk at is like 5 actions you can take or Audubon members can take to help bird conservation and policy action. And I'll get to that in just a moment, but I thought I would set the table really with talking a little bit the status of birds nationwide and in California, some of the fundamental challenges as I see them to bird conservation, and then what are some of the tools that I use, that we use at Audubon and others do, to advocate for birds and bird conservation. And I hope what I'm doing here is sort of connecting some dots for you. These are probably all things you may already know, but putting them all together to talk about why we advocate for birds the way we do and why we need people like you to engage in different ways that you're comfortable with, and how much that really helps move the dial for birds. And then I'll touch on 5 ways that you can engage really in 3 different buckets, that are some of the major things that are affecting birds and bird policy. So habitat loss and degradation, climate change, and really this need for good science for birds and sound science-based decision-making. And then we'll have time for discussion afterwards. So to start with, I don't think this is news to anybody on the call tonight, but birds in North America and really globally are really struggling. Many of you may have seen the report that came out a couple of years ago that identified that we've lost 3 billion birds in North American bird populations since 1970. That's about 1 in 4 birds that have just lost really in my lifetime, and certainly even more if we go back another 50 years behind that. In California, we've seen those declines historically. Waterfowl populations were once numbered over 35 million or more historically. Today, they're closer to 7 to 8 million on the Pacific Flyway that come through California. Some shorebird populations have declined by as much as 90%. And certainly endemic species are at risk, including, I know many of you track what's happening with tricolored blackbirds, which are now a California threatened species, but also species like the California gnatcatcher on the endangered species list, the western snowy plover, the western burrowing owl, which is not yet listed, but arguably should be. So many of these endemics are already at risk because of habitat loss and degradation, and those are even more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. When I started kind of coming up with like, what are the habitats that we're talking about here and what were the most threatened habitats, I realized the list would have been shorter if I just talked about what habitats aren't threatened. But I do think it bears noting, and I'll go into a little more of the details below, wetlands and riparian corridors have been decreased by 95% in the state from their historic highs. And those were the most biodiverse of our terrestrial habitats. Coastal sage scrub, oak woodlands, grasslands, eelgrass, the offshore subtidal habitats that we haven't paid that much attention to historically, that's declined about 90% since the 1950s. And all of these habitats are often very hard to restore once they've been damaged. And I think you'll see that as a recurring theme in some of the points we'll touch on tonight. So what are the challenges to bird conservation? And when I'm calling you to action, what are the challenges I'm asking you to meet? Well, certainly, as I've already mentioned, habitat loss and degradation. We can't talk about what's going on with birds in North America without mentioning cats. Cats kill billions of birds every year, but certainly also collisions, and I'll get into a little more detail, the risks posed by climate change, among many other things. I will note, it's interesting, I've been seeing a lot of posts in the last couple of days on social media around what's killing North American birds, and they're sort of recycling some data from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and cats always jump out at everybody. And they kind of use that as an argument to say, look, wind turbines and these other things aren't really so much of a problem. But what I like to remind people is that cats don't kill golden eagles or many of the other species that are affected by either solar panels or wind turbines. So when we're talking about these challenges, we have to be a little more specific about what bird groups we're talking about and what are the challenges that we need to address there. But in addition to these kind of well-known and well-discussed challenges to bird conservation, I do want to identify a few others. Maybe these are the sort of the social aspects. And really, is it that apathy that's in the general public? Like, if you ask anybody, they'll say they love birds. But most people don't know that birds are facing real conservation challenges. They don't know that their own actions, like letting their cat outdoors, are maybe affecting the survivability of birds. And many just lack that information. And when given that information, they're more likely to act in a way that's conservation friendly but they also have a lot of other competing needs, like helping them identify and set priorities and connect to birds. I think is something that Audubon does better than any conservation organization. That's one of the reasons I like working for Audubon. The other thing we have to identify, and this is again where people like you come in if you engage in policy and advocacy, is the inadequacy of state and federal governments, and very much the local governments, to really practice conservation well. They often lack the internal expertise. They lack adequate funding and staffing. Even the Department of Fish and Wildlife, there are lots of well-meaning, hardworking folks that are at DFW that are overworked to really face the conservation challenges in California. We often lack adequate regulation and enforcement. And a lot of times that's political will. We have a lot of really good conservation laws on the books, but Department of Fish and Wildlife often doesn't enforce them because of the political backlash they're likely to face. And that is another role, and I'll be talking a bit about that, where when folks like Audubon members stand up and let their voices be heard, you can push back against some of the more industrial or monetized interests that are active in politics, who sometimes that's all politicians hear from. So what are the advocacy tools I'll be talking a bit about tonight? And most of these, again, are well known, like in-person meetings, whether that's meeting with a legislator or testifying at hearings, going to a city council meeting or a board of supervisors meeting, and testifying about an issue that affects birds in your region. Action alerts you've probably all seen and are tired of, and maybe have banned us, but we get action alerts from Audubon asking you to write your senator or write your assembly member to take action on a piece of legislation. But there's also the emails and petitions and all those sorts of tools. Various forms of media, whether it's press releases or letters to the editor, which members can partake in, using social media in a positive and constructive way to advance the conservation message. And then a lot of our members publish reports. They write papers in Western Birds or other places about the impacts of what's happening to birds and their observations. And then educational materials, really the presentations like this one that you guys give on a regular basis, but also bird walks and the materials you present, and even casual conversations are powerful advocacy tools, and that I would encourage all of you to consider, not to preach or try to talk down to anybody, but when you make a connection with somebody and are able to share your passion of birds. And a little fact about, that we once had 4 million acres of wetlands in California, and now we have less than 200,000. We have less than 5%, which is even hurt more during the drought. That can really affect how someone thinks about the problems of the environment. And lastly, I see science as an advocacy tool. My background is as a scientist before I became a lawyer, but I understand science as a tool for advocacy, for good, sound decision-making, and for kind of pushing back against bad science, which is often used to rationalize bad projects. So before I go into some of the specifics on the work, I did want to flag, I wanted to, if you didn't know these folks, to introduce you to, for many of you, your assembly members, Cecilia Aguirre-Curry, State Senator Bill Dodd, and Mike Thompson, who, because of the redistricting, Mike is likely to be reelected in November and will be the representative for this area after John Garamendi, who's been here many years. And all of these folks, I'm putting them out there, maybe so you learn their face a little bit, and whether you meet with them or their staff, they are not imposing people, they're friendly people, often allies on our issues, but not always. And I think each of these also has very close ties with ag interests and other interests. And sometimes our interests align with ag and sometimes they don't. But I'll tell you that the lobbyists that are in there are coming from industrial groups, and they're meeting with them a lot, pushing their issues. And Audubon and Nature Conservancy and all these other groups, we need to show up too. And we need to show we have a constituency that cares about the issues, so they don't just hear from one side. So I wanted to introduce you, if you didn't know these folks already, and encourage you to build relationships one way or the other. So when I talk about sort of moving the dial on with advocacy and these different issues that we'll talk about in a moment, I wanted to give you a sense before we get into that about the scale that we're talking about for bird conservation. And this is really, to be honest, why I sort of transitioned from being a biologist, where I was going out, and I have to say, I loved being a biologist. It was the best job ever. It didn't pay anything, but I just hiked around California and got to look at birds for a living. But I realized, if I really wanted to make significant impacts for bird conservation in the state, that I needed to transition to working on policy. And this is sort of the scale that we're talking about. This is the budget from last year. So Salton Sea is one of my priority programs. And with advocacy from Audubon and others, we secured $220 million in money to go to Salton Sea restoration and dust control projects over a 3-year span. 40 million last year. This year, we got another 100 million out of that 220. And I won't go down this whole list, but you can see here 143 million for habitat restoration last year, 600 million for coastal protection work over 3 years. And this is the kind of money, if you guys start thinking about it, and I'm happy to have a deeper conversation with any of you, the nature-based solutions, urban greening and streams, that habitat restoration that can come home to Yolo County, to places that Yolo Audubon cares about. And that's one of the things that really excites me about my job. The politics do not excite me at all, I have to be honest. It's not what I live for. But the notion of being able to go and move the dial to get big dollars to save birds and to save habitats is extremely rewarding. And that's what I'm trying to invite all of you to think about, how you can engage on this. A couple of the bills that we worked on this year, and again, to kind of give you a sense of scale, just not the budget, but also legislation, was Assembly Bill 30 with Assembly Member Ash Kara, and really set the policy for the state for everyone to have access to the nature. So it's not that if Governor Newsom signs it, which he hasn't yet, but this bill passed the legislature, and when and if Governor Newsom signs it, it'll make it the policy of the state that all people should have access to nature and outdoor recreational activities. And that's important because the bill also directs state agencies to incorporate this policy into their programs and their grants and to improve the equitable outcomes to provide more nature and more access to outdoor activities in nature deprived areas across the state. And I'll tell you, one, that's just the right thing to do. Two, from the conservation movement and the bird conservation movement, the way we are successful in the future is by connecting these links with more and more people across the state, making nature important to them, helping them understand its importance and giving them access. And if we do that, we build a constituency that will fight for nature in the future. Another bill that we did this year, and real props to Santa Clara Valley Audubon, who came to us with this bill idea, is Assembly Bill 2382, which sets a policy for the state to reduce light pollution and conserve energy, and requires the state to reduce, to put on fixtures that reduce light pollution on state facilities across the state. It has certain exemptions and everything, but this is a good first step, joining about 19 other states that already have light pollution legislation in place. And we're hoping in California, this is a first step that gets us moving towards more sensible light policy and to reduce those impacts on birds, insects, and other wildlife. So that kind of gives you a sense of just this year, like working on budget and legislation. When we ask Audubon members to get involved and move the dial, so to speak, those are the kind of things at the state level that we're often asking people to get involved in. So I'm going to dial it back now and talk about these three major issues and sort of different action items that are actions that Audubon members like you can take. So again, habitat loss. It is really the primary factor for bird population declines globally, certainly in California. Again, 95% of our wetlands and riparian habitat, 33% of our oak woodland habitats have been lost. And there's a lot of other conservation challenges with oak woodlands, with oaks not regenerating, with invasive species and pests and disease. 70 to 90% of our coastal sage scrub habitats down in Southern California have been lost. About 90% of our eelgrass habitat has been lost since the 1950s. Eelgrass is hugely important for spawning for herring, which a lot of seabirds and marine mammals rely on. It's the basis of the food web. So as we see these different systems start to collapse, we are losing biodiversity all over. And so when I touch on things like 30 by 30 in a moment, I wanted to give you a sense of the scope, like we're losing so much habitat. According to NRDC, overall, we've lost 20% of California wildlife species already. And we have about 600 species of plants and animals that are threatened with extinction. So the stakes are very high and the threats are very real. This habitat loss, by the way, is not just a legacy of the past. Between 2001 and 2011, we lost the most of our natural land out of any of the Western states, about 784 square miles. So roughly the size of Los Angeles and San Diego combined. And, that was just in the last 20 years. And we are still in the last decade continuing to lose habitat. We have legislation like the California Environmental Quality Act, which we have regulation like the no net loss on wetlands policies, and yet we're still losing habitat. And so as conservation entities, we need to be pushing back and really pushing for large scale habitat protection, restoration, and other conservation strategies. And what's the outcome when those, not just the loss of habitats, but the loss of resources to the existing habitats? So up here in the upper left-hand corner, you'll see the Klamath National Wildlife Refuge. About 2/3 of waterfowl on the Pacific Flyway will make use of the Klamath during migration when there's water. But when there's not, like we're seeing in the last couple of years, and this year the lower refuges got almost no water at all, there's nowhere for the birds to go. And so what we see is significantly fewer birds able to stage there during migration. Those birds that do go there get condensed into smaller and smaller areas of stagnant water where botulism outbreaks and avian influenza can happen. Last year, we lost tens of thousands of waterfowl to a botulism outbreak. And unless we deliver not just protecting the habitat, but delivering the resources like water to habitats like the Klamath, we will continue to see these kind of outbreaks, and it will continue to contribute to overall population declines in different species. So just again, this is from the 3 billion bird report, 2.5 billion migratory birds. I wanted to kind of focus on the grassland species because I'll be talking a little more about what's at stake for the grassland birds, but a 53% loss in grassland birds across North America just in the last 50 years. So again, this very significant call to action. So what are our solutions? No major surprises here. We've known what the solutions for habitat loss really have been for at least 50 years, if not longer. And it's land protection. So, it's putting our arms around land and making it public or creating permanent protections around that. But that has some real limitations, and that's kind of an older style of conservation. We've also been looking at easements, so keeping land in private hands, putting certain protections on it. Certainly habitat restoration, but the challenge we have with habitat restoration, whether it's on public land or private land, is we haven't been able yet to scale it up to the size necessary to meet the needs of birds and other wildlife. And there's a real effort right now at the state level to facilitate permits, facilitate grants, to put a lot more state money in to expand restoration projects, but also improved management on whether it's private or public land, and the regulation of use, again, on public or private land in order to preserve biodiversity values. And what this really comes down to, these solutions, is everything needs more money, and it needs to be given greater priority and political will from politicians. And the way that happens is by constituents like you getting engaged. I touched on a little bit these new infusions of cash and priorities that are coming around habitat to try to stop this loss that we've seen over the last 50, well, really 150 years here in California. I want to flag these for you. And again, I'm happy to come back and talk about it sometime. California, under Governor Newsom's leadership, has joined an international effort called the 30 by 30 effort. And the 30 by 30 effort is to conserve 30% globally of lands and water for nature by 2030 as a stepping stone to getting to 50% protection, which many believe is necessary to prevent large-scale ecosystem collapse in many ecosystems across the world. So California is dedicated. They released a report back in May, which you can find online, the Pathways to 3030 document, about how California conserved 30% of its lands and waters by 2030. Now, we've already protected, we already have conserved, according to this report, about 22% of our lands and about 15 to 70% of our waters, or coastal waters. So it's not like we're starting from zero, but we still have a lot of work to do over the next 8 years. On the federal side, President Biden issued an executive order very early in his administration, and it became the America the Beautiful initiative, which he tried to call it 30 by 30, and the political backlash was so immense, they've kind of rebranded it as America the Beautiful. But it's really along the same lines of identifying areas we can conserve for nature. So there are these initiatives, there are these documents, there are these promises, but how do we really ultimately deliver on those things? And it really, again, requires engagement from organizations like Audubon and constituents like you. So what are the 5 things you can do here? 1, you can contact state and federal legislators and urge prioritization of habitat protection and water for wildlife. And I thought about kind of enumerating various ways that this can happen, that you can do it. What I think I will do for the sake of time is just offer my services. If this is an area you want to get involved in, reach out to me and look for the action alerts that Audubon sends. Consider participating in Audubon's Advocacy Day, which we just had back in August, and participated. It is a chance for you to meet with your legislators and share your concerns, both local and statewide, about what's happening with birds. And it's not hard. You can do it. Another thing that Yellow Audubon can take on, or individuals can take on, is tracking and engaging on the various local, either the county or the city general plans, the open space elements, the commissions, like Davis has an open space and habitat commission that actually is actively looking for restoration opportunities in the city of Davis. And I will tell you that a lot happens in California in conservation in the implementation of general plans. Unfortunately, a lot of it is bad because they often amend general plans to take away protections in order to allow development in otherwise sensitive areas. But they need people to be watching and engaging and sharing with their board of supervisors how important conservation is. You can support regional large-scale conservation efforts. So whether that is a monument effort like that has happened recently, or restoration along Cache Creek or Puda Creek, or the Yolo Bypass, there's lots of different ways that Yellow Audubon or you individually can engage to support those kind of efforts. I'm going to get a little more into this fourth one later, but contributing to science and monitoring on protected lands. I know you guys have a project on Bobcat Ranch, but there is a huge value add that Audubon, probably like no other NGO, our members provide by going out and collecting data to inform what's going on protected lands. And then again, sharing information with new birders and the public about the importance of habitat and water for birds. And that comes from a friendly voice like yours. It means more than like a professional hack like me might ever mean. Because that's really what we've seen again and again, is how the social changes on different issues happen is because someone hears from someone they trust. So I think there's a way to do that that's not proselytizing, but that invites people to learn more about a passion, about something you care about. So climate change, again, we know that this poses an existential risk to people and birds. The Audubon report that came out a couple of years ago identified that 2/3 of birds in North America are at a greater risk of extinction due to climate change. Changing the climate climate factors in a particular area, changing the habitats that are there, forcing the birds into smaller and different ranges, altering their feeding, breeding, and migratory patterns. All those things are additional stressors that we're putting on bird populations. If we take aggressive climate action to reduce emissions and keep temperatures down, global temperatures down, the estimate from our report was that we could save about 76% of those species. I think that, with politics being what they are, Audubon is also understanding that we probably won't be able to keep the level of emissions down necessary to save all 76%. And I will tell you, internally in National Audubon, while we're still working for that effort, we're trying to find ways to build resilience in bird populations and human communities in preparation for, growing and significant impacts of climate change. So what are the climate solutions? Again, probably things you all heard before about reducing emissions overall, renewable energy development, which I'll touch a bit more on in a moment, but carbon sequestration, and particularly for Audubon's interest in natural and working lands. I'll get more into that in just a second. And I think we want to also be emphasizing as Audubon advocates that we want to build resilience in human communities. So for example, urban forestry, which shades homes and reduces heat effects from extreme heat, which disproportionately affects people of color, older people, and people in disadvantaged communities. Like doing urban forestry also provides maybe some trees for birds, but really builds resilience in communities and in the environment by securing water and habitat for birds, even during drought, for example. Overall, when we talk about nature-based climate solutions, we're talking about growing trees, making wetlands, having healthy soils and grasslands in ways that provide multiple benefits by sequestering carbon, reducing emissions, and improving biodiversity outcomes. Or in the case of floodplain restoration, providing all these habitat values and reducing flood risks because we're allowing natural processes to kind of pull some of that water away from flood zones. In California, there's been a lot of momentum around this. when they released the 30 by 30 effort in May on Earth Day, they also released a natural and working lands climate smart strategy. Again, this could be its own topic of an hour-long discussion about what we mean when we say natural and working lands climate smart strategy. It's very jargony, but I think the big things, the big 4 takeaways that I took away from this report is 1, protect and enhance what already exists. Don't lose any more, dummies. Just say what you already have, don't lose it. Restore where possible and expand and accelerate restoration. Partner with private landowners. 50% of the state is owned by private landowners, and we need to work with them to achieve conservation goals. And we need to be producing more just and equitable outcomes on our climate strategies overall. And for Audubon, not only does that mean reducing emissions and impacts in climate vulnerable communities, but connecting them with the outdoors in a more just and equitable way. And really is touches on everything in California. So before I get into this bit, because I can maybe I will sense some resilience or resistance from people. Let me just say that, I started my career, as I said, as a biologist, going through a lot of riparian areas, the grasslands and oak woodlands in California. And I will just say I did not have a particularly favorable view of cows or grazing in the state, and was a skeptic and continue to be a bit of a skeptic. But I will say my colleagues that work on conservation ranching who know this stuff, who know grassland health and grassland birds very well, have won me over on this issue. And really what we're talking about with conservation ranching is a whole ranch management approach, a management plan that is designed to improve biological outcomes, biodiversity outcomes on this managed piece of land. And when you do this kind of sustainable ranching, you can increase soil health, you control weeds, you enhance native plant biodiversity, you increase overall biodiversity, bird numbers go way up on these kind of managed lands, you can reduce the emissions associated with the overall cattle operation, and you can actually keep rangelands in business and prevent their transition to less, let's say, bird-friendly uses like a vine or orchards or a vineyard or a Walmart. And there's been, we've been continuing to lose a lot of habitat in the state and grassland habitat. So finding ways to work with ranchers that want to work to have a more improved ecosystem outcome is showing real benefits. And this is a program that's continuing to grow across the country and in California. So what are some actions you can take on climate and natural working land solutions? So again, urging those legislators that I identified before to prioritize funding for natural and working land solutions. This should be an area that Assembly Member Migratory can lead on and Senator Dodd can lead on because of their close ties with many ag well, I'll just say constituents. And, but they're also members who sometimes really need a push from the environmental community to make sure they're considering the environmental needs in any piece of legislation. More locally, you can track renewable energy projects as they start to get built here or proposed here in Yolo County. And I will urge you, if you haven't had a presentation from my colleague Gary George in a while, he gives a great talk on renewable energy. And Gary talks a lot about the existential threat posed by climate change and the fact that we need renewable energy. But our expectations at Audubon is that as projects are getting proposed, they get proposed in the right way, they get built in the right way, and they have avoidance and mitigation measures. And what Gary really encourages everybody is if you can find a way to improve a project and say yes, even if you're going to have to accept some impacts to habitats or birds or other wildlife, he encourages us to do that, Audubon as an entity to do that, because it gives us a lot more credibility when we have to come say no, or when we have to come in and weigh in on a project and say, well, we don't like this, this, and this. If you make those changes, we'll be okay with it. Because if you're just sort of the entity that always shows up and says no, it gets very easy to just get marginalized. That doesn't mean to say you need to say yes just to please people. And I can give you an example. I've worked on the Altamont Pass for 15 years. It's the largest wind farm, or was at one time, in North America. It kills way too many birds. And I'm working continually to try to reduce that and get the county and the companies to be accountable. And because the county and the companies were not responding to us, even though we've been trying to collaborate for 15 years, we actually filed a lawsuit against a particular project last November, and we're continuing to litigate that now. I don't want to stop that project. I just want that project to abide by the best management practices that have been proposed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Department of Fish and Wildlife, and other scientists that say those are the BMPs necessary for the project to avoid the worst impacts to golden eagles and other sensitive species. So to bring it back, if you can track renewable energy projects in Yolo County and engage and be a positive voice where possible, you can kind of really contribute to that climate progress in the county. There's a climate county action plan if you're interested in getting involved in that. I know the City of Davis has some opportunities like that as well. I know also that Yolo Audubon has the phrenology study at Bobcat Ranch, and it's really important, and it provides real value to Audubon and to the science in general. So if you're interested in that, I know Anne can connect you with the folks doing it and to get involved. And then you can also always advocate with your wallet. If you are interested in Audubon conservation ranching, Westlake Market here in Davis sells Audubon certified beef. And it is really important if this whole program is to work, that we can demonstrate to the beef producers that there's a market out there for their product where people are willing to spend a little more on beef that is more sustainably managed in a way that benefits native plants and native birds. So you can advocate with your wallet there. The last big bucket I wanted to talk about really is community science as a tool in the toolbox for good policy. And community science is a term I use as opposed to citizen science. I think there's a real transition from referring to citizen science to be more broad and inclusive as community science. So I want to clarify the terminology for you there. And when I was doing some prep for this presentation today, I came across this quote from Dr. Mark Urban, who works at the Institute for in Connecticut. And you can read this yourself, but I really, I guess, pulled up my old biologist heartstrings about when he was talking about in this paper really was that biologists are sometimes distracted by scientific models. We can come up with models for all sorts of things and predictions about impacts from climate or drought or habitat changes. And it all becomes very abstract and a lot of sort of computer variables that get moved around. But in the end, what we need to do is go out, as he says, pull on our boots, grab our binoculars, and go into the field and see what's really happening out there. And that is a service that Audubon members have been providing for over 100 years and hopefully will in the future. And so I hope you feel inspired to know, and I want to give some examples really about how that the data that you gather influences how we talk about policy and how we move in the policy circles. Now, let me give a caveat to this first, which is the charts that you see up here are some things that I put together. I pulled the data down for the Christmas bird counts for Poudre Creek going back to 1970 and actually 1975. Because trying to fit all 50 years was a little too much on the chart, I just went in 5-year increments. This is not, this is just the raw data that was taken based on observer hours, number of birds seen, controlled by the number of observer hours for the event. And when Audubon and others use the CBC results, there's a lot more scrubbing and cleaning that goes on in the data. So I just wanted to give that caveat in case there's any other scientists on the call that are like, what are you doing? You can't show this. What I wanted to show you a little bit though was like, even just looking at the raw numbers adjusted for effort, we see this kind of at least indication, which makes us want to do a more rigorous study on declines, for example, on loggerhead shrike and the western meadowlark. And these are some quotes I pulled from conservation sort of reports on both these species respectively, which used the breeding bird survey, which has taken, the breeding bird survey obviously happened at a different time of year, but has been indicating declines in both these species, both grassland species, by the way, and it's one of the reasons I wanted to highlight the loss of grassland species. So what I'm saying is that like when you go out to the Christmas bird count and you record that data, that is going into this long-term database. There's nothing like it. More responsible scientists than me are coming in and cleaning and controlling for errors and other variables, but they can use that to talk about these declines, to monitor these declines over time. They can use it for things like this. If you haven't seen the email that just came out in the last week from National Audubon, dig it out of your clutter or your spam box, or you can just Google Audubon Migratory Bird Explorer, And it's a new tool that my colleagues at National Audubon, the science team, have come up with, where you can really put in any bird in North America, and you can see about how those birds move and migrate throughout the year. And as you can see in this slide, the data sources that they get this from include eBird and Christmas bird counts and bird surveys and things like that. The breeding bird survey. So again, when you're out there collecting this data, folks are using this for really serious products that we're trying to use to move the dialogue. So what can you do? So again, reaching out to our friends in the Assembly and the Senate and even the Congress, advocating for funding for science and monitoring. I will say this as an old biologist, getting money for science and monitoring is like one of the hardest things to do. People will pay for restoration, they need to pay more, but they'll more readily pay for restoration than they will for the science and monitoring needed to make sure that restoration was actually successful. So we need to keep hammering on that. It's important to make sure that there's enough science, enough money to fund good science, to understand what's happening now, like Dr. Urban said, but also over the long term so we can make good adaptive management decisions. You can do that also just actively collecting the data by participating in the CBC, the Great Backyard Bird Count, other community science events that like Yellow Audubon puts on, including other Yellow Audubon science efforts and I know that you guys do a grant program for students, like continuing to support the overall scientific effort around birds and bird conservation is probably something that Audubon members excel at better than any other group. Log sightings into eBird, and I will admit too, like I have resisted eBird in the past. I am not as diligent as I should be at times, but when you do it, know that you're adding real value to a long-term database, which is one of the most valuable things for ecological research and management. And then lastly, on the science side, is invite and mentor new birders. We need to be raising up these new generations of people. We need to be really welcoming and accessible to them. And it needs to be a broader suite of people than traditionally have been Audubon members, which are older and whiter and wealthier people. How are we inclusive and welcoming to a broader network of people that makes Audubon a healthy and vibrant organization into the next century? So overall, again, I've kind of repeated these themes again and again, but engaging elected officials, tracking your local planning and projects, and engaging strategically on those issues. Supporting Yellow Audubon or creating new programs here, stepping into leadership to help lead the chapter over time. Participating in community science like the CBC and using eBird, and educating and mentoring new birders, or just sharing your love of birding with other people and inviting them to understand those connections of habitat and why the conservation efforts that we're advocating for are so important, potentially turning them into new advocates. So that's kind of my general overview and the sort of actions that you can take. There's many more actions you can take, many more issues we can discuss. So I will stop sharing my screen and we can go into the group thing, and feel free to come on to video and or ask any questions.
Mike, there was a comment in the chat. Again, it mentioned that the Cows for Climate seems to be, okay, let me start over. Cows for Climate seems to work very well at the Sutter Buttes. I'm not sure I know anything about that. Do you have anything to say about that, Mike?
I don't, and I don't have an easy list. Have you guys had Pelayo or Matt Allshouse come present to you guys about conservation ranching? And
yes.
You have? Okay.
Yes.
I can't tell you offhand. I will tell you that those guys have been out over the last 2 or 3 years actively recruiting folks to join in the Audubon conservation ranching in California. And they've more than like doubled, I think, their targets for enrolling people in the program. So that might be one of the ones that's already in the program. I don't know all the names of the users.
Gaina has her hand up and she's the one who wrote the comment. So let's let her tell us.
Right.
Yeah, I don't know if it's officially that situation, but it's accidentally that situation. The Sutter Buttes, Middle Mountains, that whole area there is owned by ranchers and has been for about 150 years. And they're still there. And the Sutter Buttes is still there, relatively pristine and not really being hurt by the cattle because it's handled correctly. So I don't know if it's officially part of that program, but it's definitely something that works. And the Sutter Buttes is still a beautiful natural area. So That's why I
Yeah.
want to share it.
And it's just to add on to that a little bit, this is one of the, and I'll say even for me, kind of winning me over a little bit on the issue was, a lot of the grasslands and rangelands in California, right, historically had a lot of grazers that were actively feeding in those areas. And the trick with conservation ranching is it can't be as dense, it can't be as intensive on the grazing. You have to have fewer cattle, you have to move them around more often. You have to keep them out of areas like riparian areas, like creeks, or keep them away from grazing if there's an endangered or a rare and threatened plant species. But if they're well managed, they can then replicate some of those natural processes, and we see the native plants thrive. Diane.
Diane, yeah.
Yeah, I had two questions. One's just a kind of a yes, no question, and was on AB 30 and 2382, I guess, is 2382 pending on the governor's desk too?
It is, yeah.
Yeah, so my question was, would it be a good idea for us to write letters to the governor urging him to sign them, or what's the status on that?
Yeah, it's actually, we're having a social discussion with our social media person tomorrow about which action alerts we want to do. Without getting much into it, the governor's office has not been very communicative about like where they were going. They did a bunch of climate bills last week, and we weren't sure if some of our bills were going to be included in there or not. One of our bills was, which I didn't mention, which is AB 2278. But but yes, if you see an action alert from us, or if you guys want to take the initiative to just write the governor's office, that's fantastic.
Yeah, but the best idea would be to wait for an action alert from you folks if we're already signed up for that, or
yeah, that'd be great. Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
And then my other question, and maybe this is one that's more to Palaio, because it's on the cattle question again. I just was curious about how you approach the landowners. What are the incentives for them to get involved in the program, and is there any pushback from other parts of the agricultural community on the program, or is there generally pretty good acceptance of it? Like, if we know a rancher that we think might be approachable, I mean, what would we do?
So I will say the sense I've gotten from both Palaio and Matt Allhouse, and Matt Allhouse really grew up around ranching, and so he speaks the lingo, is, it's really about building relationships to start. And then you get a sense, I mean, a lot of the ranchers that are out there, I mean, they do love the land. They know the oaks, they know the birds that are out there, and they know what's happening to grasslands and rangelands in California, because we're losing a lot. And a lot of them want to stay in business. So part of the incentive there is, one, being able to maintain that lifestyle. Two, we're trying to incentivize them through market forces by, it's sort of like bird-friendly coffee, right? Shade-grown coffee, like create a niche market where they can make a little more money on, whether it's like kind of like organic or whatever, on this accredited beef, which is why we want to demonstrate the market. The other thing is Audubon, or whoever is helping them with this, we can come to them and provide a service that they don't pay for, to help them come up with a management plan for their ranch to make it more sustainable. So we really try to minimize costs to them, and then provide them with that financial incentive on the back end.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Oh, there's a question from Joe about how does light pollution harm birds? Well, it harms them in a variety of ways. So artificial light at night, which is the acronym is ALAN, and you can, if you Google that, the Night Skies Society and others have a lot of information online about it. But artificial light at night can pull birds off their migratory route. So as they're migrating at night, I think like 80% of migratory birds migrate at night, they get attracted by artificial light and will get drawn to that. Now, in the extreme cases, like on the Farallon Island, when they would have the lighthouse go, like there was times where people would report like having swarms of birds during the migratory season pulled off and like circling the light as it was going around. But even just more city light and things, it pulls the birds down, confuses them, and they don't like have their normal migratory behavior. It also has really significant adverse impacts on insects. They get attracted to it, and then birds come. and they try to feed on those insects that are there, again, disrupting their normal patterns. Lastly, it really contributes to collisions. So they get attracted to a tower or a building that's well lit, and then the bird collides. If you look online for bird collisions in New York, Montreal, Chicago, it is a really significant problem. And it's why those cities have kind of led on the lights out effort, because during migration, they will go around and collect hundreds of birds the next morning that will run into buildings. We don't have quite that same kind of migratory density on the West Coast, but we know that it still pulls birds off their migratory routes and disrupts them. And lastly, the artificial light can kind of trigger birds to go into a breeding cycle outside of their normal rhythm, which can have all sorts of adverse impacts for their success and productivity. It also isn't good for people, by the way. So it's better to have dark skies. That was probably more of an answer than you wanted, Joe, but thanks for letting me answer.
Anyone else? Question or comment?
Just a
I have
quick
a question.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Ann.
Okay, did I end then you're next? But I'm not sure if my dogs are gonna cooperate, but I'll talk fast. On the conservation ranching bill, Diane and I met at Advocacy Day. We met with Assemblywoman Alkiar Curry and promoted the conservation ranching bill, and there was no one against it in the Senate or the Assembly that I heard about. Yet the Assemblywoman seemed to know there might be trouble, and it was vague though. And then sure enough, it didn't pass. What happened?
Sure. So since I didn't really go into this in the talk, I'll give folks a little bit of a background. So this year, Audubon, well, it's actually our third year, but this year, Audubon, California had a piece of legislation to create a conservation ranching program at the Wildlife Conservation Board, which would actually be where then we could use state budget dollars that could go into the conservation ranching program to help ranchers implement conservation ranching practices and these kind of plans. The bill had pretty much unanimous bipartisan support through both houses. We had no opposition. We had Cattlemen's Association on board, and we had Defenders of Wildlife and the California Native Plant Society on board. There's probably never been a piece of legislation that had both those entities in support. And we got through the Senate just fine. Senator John Laird, he's a very powerful and knowledgeable senator. And then we went to the Assembly, and we got to the Assembly Appropriations Committee. The Appropriations Committee is any bill that has a fiscal cost associated with it has to go to appropriations. And if it has a cost of more than $100,000 or so, it goes into what's called a suspense file. And that suspense file is honestly, this is like the worst of politics. Well, Diane probably knows more about this than I do, but it is like a black box where leadership and members just kind of duke it out over their priorities. And we got a analysis from the appropriations staffer and that said, well, we think this conservation ranching program is similar to some existing programs like the upland habitat, which is an upland waterfowl habitat program it's actually at the Department of Conservation at another entity. And so we don't know that there's necessarily the need for this at WCB. And I think that little kernel of doubt was enough to give them the excuse to not push it out of the Appropriations Committee. It's unfortunate because one, WCB, who we wanted to do the program with, supported the program, said it's different enough than all this other stuff that we should do it here. But the other thing is my new associate, Samantha Samuelson, who works for state policy for us, was Senator John Laird's staffer this year as this was happening. And her take on it really was, yes, there was that analysis of it being a little too similar to existing programs, but also Laird had spent a lot of political capital on a couple of other very major bills. And there's a feeling like, well, he's already, kind of spent his ammunition on these two things. He can't get everything he wants, so we'll take this away. And that sounds so petty.
Yeah.
But Diane, are you disagreeing or are you agreeing with me?
Just shaking my head at the absurdity of it, but I agree with you absolutely that happens. Sometimes it's just politics more than the
Yeah.
policy, power plays.
Yep. So
Yeah.
I'll say, because we have a good partnership with the Wildlife Conservation Board, for those of you that don't follow all this wonky stuff, the Wildlife Conservation Board is sort of the main grant-making body for the state of California for large-scale habitat restoration, acquisition, and those sorts of things. And they're a great agency. So we have a really good relationship with them, and we're talking about ways to invest in conservation ranching even without the legislation. And then what we'll do as we're sort of implementing this program as best we can with the existing regulatory framework is if we need to run another bill next year, we will. And we will do it in such a way that'll make it clear that it's not duplicative or what doesn't too closely replicate what's already existing in law. And so we feel like we can move forward, make investments, and then if we need to, we can fine tune it with some legislation next year that shouldn't get caught up in the assembly appropriations process. So that's sort of what happened to that bill. It was very disappointing to have a unanimously supported bill just sort of peter away, but that is politics. So
I'm learning.
yeah,
Thanks. Any other questions before we wrap it up here? Well, Mike, thank you so much. That was an excellent talk, and hopefully we'll energize some of us to pick up some of your advocacy tips and move forward with them. You make it sound easy.
Let me just tell you, and Anne, you've done this, and Diane's done it too. Like, for any of you who haven't met with an elected official before, and whether it's county, city, or assembly, or Congress, you don't have to be an expert on the issue. You just have to come in and explain your position. If you're meeting with us, we will help you with bullet points and practicing. They don't expect you to be a super bird expert or a super habitat or a finance expert or any of that. Share them with your perspective and your priorities, and they are always receptive, Democrat or Republican. And I think it's kind of cool to participate in the democratic process like that. So I just strongly encourage you, and happy to help however I can, anyone here, to get involved like that.
Well, and you, Mike, and your team did an amazing job of organizing. 400 and some people signed up as volunteers. Now, not all of them actually showed up. It complicates everything, but I'd say it was fun. And I really appreciated that the Assemblywoman actually sat with us for 20-25 minutes on Zoom, and it was time really well spent. And Diane went to a couple of others, and you met with Senator Dodd's staff, right? And Diane, and anyway, it's worthwhile. And I put out the word to all of our Audubon members last summer, but I think in the summer people sort of don't pay attention as much, and we'll do a better job, Mike, of drumming up some business for you next summer.
However I can help, let me know. I committed to Bart that I would do the CBC this year. I've been a little I've been a little lapsing in it. I used to run it when I was in the Bay Area, and I've taken a few years off, a little bit of burnout, but I'll be back. Bart won't let me out of it this year. So
Great.
Yes,
And
great.
there's Bart, who is in charge of the CBC for us, and he'll be putting out the word to everybody. And Bart, it sounds like it's going to be sort of a normal year for CBC, and you're inviting people, anyone who wants to attend,
Yes,
correct?
yes, absolutely. And just to echo Mike's point about CBCs and eBird, citizen science is huge, and I think the best thing we can do in the immediate future is really get a big CBC going and get back to normal, and hopefully in person do the post-count workshop. Really look forward to that.
Yeah, so stay tuned. We'll be getting you more information through our various means. And I'm going to turn it back over to Ken to tell us about next month's speaker before we adjourn.
Okay, thanks, Ann. You're assuming I know, but luckily this time I do. Next month, we're going to have John Sterling, who's going to give a talk on his recent trip to I think Bolivia and Argentina. And the rare birds of those countries. Is there another country down there with the
I
bee?
think there was, but I can't remember what it is.
Oh
Anyway,
man,
South
on the tip of my
America
tongue. It's gonna be South America. Argentina's in it, and a bonus country. Okay, I'm looking forward to it. And so I don't know if this was work or his tour company, but whatever it is, John's going to put on a good show. He always has, in my opinion. And so I hope you'll join us next month. That should be available soon. That information to sign up on Zoom. So that's it. Mike Lyons, thank you so much for sharing your evening with us. Some folks in the chat have said, thank you, and it's great information. I had an experience years ago with with somebody in Sacramento, and I was kind of left with, like I eaten lima beans or something when I left there. I wasn't feeling too hot about that experience, but perhaps I'll try it again. So anyway, thank you all for joining, and I hope the rest of your evening goes well. And Mike, again, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. Bye, everybody.
Where'd it go? Oh, okay. Let me stop the recording.